Well, welcome. Welcome to our second session of Journalism Under Siege, Truth and Trust in a Time of Turmoil. It's great to see you all back.
Third.
I'm having so much fun.
At the time, yes, right.
Time's flying. We're on the third one. Oh no, we only have 2 more left after this one.
Well.
I'm Dawn Garcia. I am the director of the John S. Knight Journalism Fellowships Program and the co-host of this course with Michael Bolden, who's here in the front row. He's the JSK Managing Director for Communications. So this speaker series is a collaboration of the John S. Knight Journalism Fellowships Program and Stanford Continuing Studies. Each of the 5 nights, we are devoting the conversation to 5 important issues for the JSK Fellowships Program and for journalism. Tonight's class, which is the 3rd, thank you, is how journalists cover bias, intolerance, and injustice. And tonight we've invited journalists who will provide a variety of perspectives on this topic. The first part of the evening is going to be me in conversation with Richard Louie, who's anchor for MSNBC and NBC News. And Richard has reported from around the world on a range of issues, including human trafficking, and he's led conversations on the state of race in America. We'll take a short break after our first session. We'll have a chance for questions as well. In the second part of the evening, Geraldine Moriba, who's a 2019 JSK Fellow and founder of Moriba Media, will moderate a panel of journalists who deal every day with issues of diversity and inclusion and coverage on a range of issues, from Muslim communities in America to how to encourage diverse voices to be heard and read on the op-ed pages of the New York Times. As I said, every evening, as we've done before, we will have a chance for questions. Erica Bartholomew, waving her hand over there, will have index cards if you'd like to have any questions, and then just pass them toward that Erica's side of the auditorium. And we'll try to get to as many as we can at the end of each session. Just a final reminder that a full syllabus for this course and readings, links to sites we think are interesting and helpful, and recommended books are on the Canvas site. And as I said, no quizzes, but we hope you find those materials interesting to help you with your understanding about journalism today. So tonight's topic, how journalists cover bias, intolerance, and injustice. I'm going to introduce Richard just a little bit more because he's got a great, interesting background and some local connections here. So he's, as I said, been at MSNBC, an anchor since 2010. And he spent 5 years at CNN Worldwide, most recently with CNN Headline News. He was a solo anchor of the 10 a.m. hour of a Morning Express, and he led political reporting throughout the 2018 presidential election. Being a native Californian myself, I was interested to see Richard's California ties, and there are many. He grew up in San Francisco, 16th and Geary, he mentioned, and his passion for covering politics, knowing about politics, started in the 1970s on bus rides to school when he was debating Proposition 13. This is a nerdy guy. But
Oh, it was fun.
But that interest turned into a job at age 19. He was campaign manager for a San Francisco College Board incumbent, Alan Wong. So
he lost, by the way. That
did
year.
he?
Yeah,
oh, shoot. Okay. So
I'm that good.
Oh, well, it was your first job. We'll give you some slack there. In the 90s, he reported for news radio KALX. I'm thinking that's Los Angeles. No.
KALX, Go Bears.
Okay.
Sorry.
Oh, Berkeley.
Sorry, yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Okay.
Hold the eggs.
That other place. We have the better colors, yeah. During a really interesting time, he was assigned stories including Dianne Feinstein's first Senate campaign and the Rodney King verdict and riots, of which I was an editor at the Mercury News at the time during that coverage. Yeah. He spent 25 years in community service, which is not something all journalists do, I would say, unless you do community service for your community in general. But in Africa, Asia, the United States, volunteering for the Asia Pacific American Institute for Congressional Studies and many other areas. He's also had a career in startups and technology companies here in Northern California. He earned his BA, University of California, and Master's in Business Administration from the Ross School of Business at the University of Michigan. One interesting personal note that I found really, really heartening and wonderful about Richard is that a few years ago he decided to spend more time in California. He isn't, working, of course, in TV as he did in New York, but his father got Alzheimer's, and he decided to work with his boss and devise his schedule so he can split his time between New York and San Francisco. And we talked about that a little earlier,
Yep.
so it's really a wonderful thing to do. So let's start.
Let's do it.
Okay, so
And thank you.
you're welcome. It's great to have you.
It's good to be here at JSK. Yeah, thanks.
We had some discussions earlier. This is a time where issues of prejudice and bigotry are on the rise, and journalists have to navigate some pretty interesting issues of personal identity sometimes when they're to inform the public on these issues. You were the first Asian American male to anchor a daily news broadcast in America, if I have that correct. What was that like, and did you know you were a first?
So it's interesting, Dawn, because it was at CNN, and it was not necessarily one of my objectives, but when I first decided to move from business into journalism, as we all do, being good students, we look for other benchmarks, folks you can learn from, get some advice, steer the ship one way versus the other. And I found that I did not find anybody that looked like me that I could say, hey, what's going on? Specifically. So I reached out to others that maybe have gone or were going through similar pathways. You did not need to be Asian, nor did you need to be male. You could be female going through a shift in your career at the age of 40. You could be in broadcast news. You could have been African American and male and just starting out in TV anchoring. So that was what I was trying to understand. The thing about it was, I didn't know that there was nobody else out there, and that was surprising to me. And then what I realized after going on air is I had to own it in a way that I didn't think I would have to own it. I realized that before I would say anything or do anything, there were certain understandings or suppositions about that which I was about to say or what I might represent. And that was, for me, something that took about 5 to 10 years to say, okay, this is what I am. Asian American guy, I'm gonna tell some Asian American stories, but 98% of my other stories are not about that. They're about America. They're about all the corners, all the great spaces, all of the great profiles and interviews and things that we sometimes make us grimace and sometimes make us smile. And yeah, occasionally I will do one of those stories, but really trying to own that this thing took a long, long time. And I did not get into journalism to sit on if you will, the long couch and going through my own psychiatry. I did not do that. But I had to go through that because that was, I think, sort of forced upon me, but in a good way. I think I am stronger for it. I think that I'm more realist about the way this sort of difference is, because I don't find it's actually, I find more sameness at the end of all of this conversation.
Yeah, talk about that, the sameness. What do you see when you look at stories that you're doing across America?
So when I'm doing stories, so for instance, I was sent out to Ferguson and Baltimore during very difficult times for our country. I was, as you mentioned also, one of my first stories was about Rodney King right here in California, and something I didn't know about our great state, that we would have this sort of pain that had not been talked about and released and faced, right? And so when I've done stories about different ethnic groups, we'll say, since we were talking about that, for instance, there was one story up in Seattle, Washington, and there was a fantastic operetta called the Mikado. And it has been played for 100+ years, right? Maybe some of you have seen the operetta. But the issue with it, Dawn, was that it put all of its actors, because the criticism that the playwrights were trying to make of was of the British government. But they couldn't, because if they were to do that at that time, they would have been, all sorts of different things would have happened to them. So they set it in Japan. And so for 100 years, this criticism of government happened in the construct of Japan. And so the actors most often were not Japanese and would wear makeup on their face, so they would appeared to be those old caricatures of what Japanese might be, which is a white face, right? With a white makeup. I started the piece, and the way I pitched the piece was about how we went through similar characterizations of another group in America, and that happens to be African Americans. Little Black Sambo or Al Jolson. And the way I pitched it to my editor was, that's what I led with, because the way we pitch stories is it's one paragraph, and then you send it off to your executive producer. I led with that in my pitch, and I said it's still happening today, but with Asians in America. And so when I flew up to Seattle to do that story, you saw a whole, just like this room, representing all the faces in this room standing out, saying we can't do this anymore. This is not good to have, actors wearing yellow face, not blackface, walking around like this, and bowing, and with very strange little names that they were given, and they were talking in the ching chong sort of way on stage, and we just don't do that anymore. It's just, that's the way they did it 100 years ago, but guess what? It ain't 100 years ago. It's not. No. And what was more surprising, which I learned when I was up in Seattle, and this was, what was very racially charged for the Japanese American community, this was where the very first Asian American civil rights group was ever formed in America, JACL, in Seattle, Washington. Seattle. And so there we are, the birth of the Japanese American civil rights group, and this very play is happening. And so that was a way of talking about difference, but sameness. And then, the way we ended it was there's going to be a conversation that's going to happen. And there was a conversation that happened, a lot like this. They all gathered later on, and they decided, guess what, we don't need to do it that way anymore. And the producers were not these horrible people that some of the statements were. They were learning too. Right. And so they adjusted the operetta, and now it's better. The communities are getting along better now, and they understand something about them. It's one of the oldest Japanese American communities in our country.
Yes, well, that's great. I did not know that about that story.
I didn't either.
So we're going to keep on some questions about you, because you have an interesting background and family history. So we had been talking earlier so you're a first-generation American, and you mentioned that your grandfather was an undocumented or illegal, we've talked about the words are important, immigrant to this country. How does your life experience and having that family background affect your coverage of the very hot topic of immigration?
So this is really interesting. The way I remembered this was I was on CNN. We just finished doing a story about immigration. And then we went to break, and I was sitting there, as I normally am during break. I kind of take a breath, and I look and see what our next segment was going to be. And I thought about it, it's like, hey, wait, this story about immigrants in America here illegally, that's my background. Now, why did it take me 20 years basically to go, that is me too, or my family story? Was because what clicked into my brain was I remember when I went to the cemetery when my grandmother passed. And my last name is Louis, by the way. We show up and we unveil the tombstone. And it says Wong on it, W-O-N-G. And I'm like, I'm 15 at that time. I'm like, Dad, are we really that cheap? Was that good of a price? Us Asians, we're a little cheap sometimes. So I was like, well, that's kind of crazy. But what he found out, my father found out in his 40s, because he walked over to his oldest sister, and his oldest sister said, Grandma did not want us ever to bring this up because she was afraid the entire family was going to get pushed out. So even during the 50s, when the government said, it's A-OK, Grandma still said, no, we're not going to tell them our real last name. Wow. So my real last name is Wong. I'm really Richard Wong. I have the Wong name. Thank you. Good night, everybody. No. I just want to see if we're all still awake right now. Oh. But so then fast forward to CNN, we're doing this segment on immigration. And that's when I said, oh, that's me. Yeah. Oh, wait, that's America. that is what we've gone through, whether it's a left or right administration. We've gone through solutions given this dynamic of what we represent to the world and what we represent to each other here in the United States. And so that was that realization. And then, so when I do stories on immigration, and for instance, I was doing, we were talking about this earlier, I was doing a story on dreamers. And there's a significant number of dreamers, kids that were brought here from Asia. Just like when you talk about the undocumented or unauthorized or the illegal immigrants here in the United States, there's about 11 million, many people say. 1 out of 10 are from Asia. So there's 1 million of folks that look like me. And those are my grandparents. Yeah. Those are my grandparents when they came here. And so it was one of the first stories I did at CNN, by the way, was on this thing called Paper Sons. And the reason why, which we can talk for a long, long time. But now when I'm talking about immigration, I want all sorts of different faces, because we have folks that have gone through the story that have white faces, black faces, brown faces, purple faces, yellow faces. And so when I do segments, I put them all up just so we understand it's just not one background. So I take that part of what I remembered I was, and I certainly make it part of my storytelling. Am I going to stand out and say, this is good or bad? Or no, what I'm going to do is say, I have a unique understanding of the topic, and I'm going to try to bring more information to you so you can hopefully take it to your water cooler. You're not going to hear me say it's good or bad. That's not what I'm going to do.
Okay, great. So let's shift it a little bit. We're talking tonight about how journalists cover intolerance, bias, injustice. So there's a real tension, I think, between two mandates in journalism. So on the one hand, there's a commitment to what has been called objective reporting, and the other is shining a light on injustice in our society. And these two things are both values in journalism. This tension, I think, has become more apparent in our current politicized moment when there's many issues that come up for all kinds of people, and some of those people are journalists as well. So just thinking about life experience and how you cover things from who you are, from what you've seen. So, where does journalism end? What is too far? What is activism? What is journalism?
Sure. So I'm very active in the space of fighting human trafficking. I'm very active in the space of gender equality. And the reason being is because the two of them are quite intertwined if you understand human trafficking and why we see markets of trafficking around the world that are unfettered and yet very equivalent. And one might say, okay, if you say that's wrong, is that activism now opinion? Is it no longer journalism, right? Because I'm saying human trafficking is wrong. But I would ask any journalist who would say human trafficking is good. Any journalist that might say misogyny is good or gender inequality is good. So I think there are certain spaces in this difficult time. I have clearly said such things within recent cycles, and I think many have. I'm not unique to this space that has said, no, there's no way that we will accept such language, number one. We will not accept the treatment and the representation of women in such ways. Clearly, I will join the ranks. Will I overstep myself and say it is a gargantuan campaign against one half of our humanity? No, I won't say that. That is not as far as I will go. I will go to what I know is true, and that is the numbers say X, Y, and Z. When we're looking at those who are trafficked, the majority are women, whether for sex or for labor. When we look at the numbers when it comes to earnings power, very obvious to all of us. When we hear certain words, there is no false equivalence. There's no equivalent to be brought to it. It is just wrong. Now, there are other spaces where often, and I know many of you in this room have gone through the very debate, either because you're in the space, you're in media, you're in journalism, where we will try to bring a balance to the argument. Now, me being a rhetoric major, I love that. I will, if there is something on the other side, I will try to build the argument so I understand my argument. I don't necessarily agree with it, per se. But that's not about whether I agree with it. You know, you get asked this question all the time.
Right.
Do you ever tell stories you don't agree with? All the time. But that's not my job, right? In fact, all the journalists here know that. There's lots of things we have to talk about that we may not agree with.
Right.
But that's not our job when we put on the journalism hat. Our journalism hat is to say, what are the facts?
Right.
What's the story? Who are the humans behind this?
Right. So talk a little bit about how you got into an interest in human trafficking and trying to stop that from happening around the world.
Well, I know that's the very topic that we're in right now. I'm not a good reporter when it comes to trafficking. And what I realized is I was one of those reporters early on, and I still struggle with it, to sensationalize women and girls. My first story on human trafficking was in Batam, Indonesia. And I went to my editor over at CNN and I said, I want to do some undercover video. I'm going to bring in a camera. And so I went down into the brothel. I had my producer with me who was local. I could not speak Bahasa Indonesia, which is the local language, so he could. Mm-hmm. I pretended that I was the foreigner wanting to buy a girl for 24 hours. He pretended to be, my fixer that you can get when you go to Indonesia. And then the house mother stood right there. Mm-hmm. Producer was here, translating for me. The girls came into a space that's about a third of this big, with a glass counter, which looks a lot like the Safeway counter when you go to buy your meats and chickens and things like that. The fluorescent lights were above all of them, and then you saw the girls come in, 15, 14, 12, and I bought, and you, being the house mother, said, she's the popular one, she's the newest one, she is the most expensive one, she is from this area. I got the most popular one and paid $25. And then she hit another bell. They all got up and they walked out the door. The one that I had picked for $25 said, the house mother said she can go back and change. She came back, she changed out of her negligee, again, 15 years old, changes into street clothes, and then we proceed to walk up the stairs out from underground. And the one thing that stood out in her bag was a teddy bear. And when we got to the hotel, I told her, we're journalists. You can leave now. We want to tell your story. We will protect your identity. You will not see your head or face. And so she said yes. But I realized 5 to 10 years later, in the course of that time, this was 10 years ago when I did the story, is that we left her behind. We did protect her face and identity, but we knew that if somebody really, 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 and so I didn't like the fact that we went through the proper steps. We could have done more. I wanted to do more and do better. And so since then, I have changed the structure of my stories and tried to not be, there's a lot of problems with that story, is that it was over there. It was in Indonesia. When here in the United States, the Justice Department says we have anywhere from like 30 to 40,000 trafficked sex slaves here in the United States. So my stories have now moved towards what's happening here in America. Because if we believe it here in America, guess what? We're pretty resourceful here. Us spending $1 or spending a calorie of our energy to do something, we can change so much. So now it's a focus of telling stories about brothels in America, which exist, these neighborhood brothels in every state in our country, which was one of my first investigative pieces when I first joined 30 Rock. And I've tried to refocus and be more responsible about that space. I mean, like any craft, we're all learning. And I knew it was something that was always wrong. And I look back then and I was thinking, I could have done better. And so it's okay to admit, I think that, but then to do better. Yeah. So it's evolved for me, Dawn, as a storyteller. Right. Yeah. And I'm trying to now look at, dirty supply chains, where we have slave labor in the stuff that we wear here in America.
Right, and that's the case.
Yes, everything, unless somebody here can raise their hand and say, I went purposely to buy a shirt that says it's sustainable. Anybody in here? Okay, one person. So that's very representative. How many more other people in the room, right? So it's like 2%.
Yeah.
The rest all includes some form of slave labor.
So we're talking just a bit ago about objectivity and the conflicts or the two charges that journalists have about objectivity and shining a light on injustice. Is there such a thing as objectivity, do you think? Or are there words like fairness and accuracy? Do they do it?
Yeah. Being a rhetoric major, I would say no. But you try your darndest to do it, right? Mm-hmm. It's are you a person of Plato, where you believe there's some absolutes, or do you believe? Obviously, I believe in the Socratic method, right? That we will sit here and we'll find the truth that way. Mm-hmm. So, and if you put on your religious hat, then you go, yes, of course, I believe in the Platonic absolutes. But I think in reality, we strive for objectivity. Mm-hmm. We're just not perfect. The question is, how imperfect are we? Yeah. And we'll have different gradations. I have a different gradation depending on the story and the efforts that we might make. And there's different, certainly there's certain core facts mm-hmm. to the stories we put together. Mm-hmm. And of course, we fact check everything. But for instance, when we have a breaking news story and there are death counts, interrupt me if you're going to.
No, it's okay. Keep going. I have one more.
If there are death counts, we absolutely are super, super careful about that. Doesn't matter.
Accuracy.
Yes. If the AP says X, we will wait depending on the story, we will wait for our own fact-checking process to happen internally at NBC. Even though it's the AP and, the AP is the AP.
Right. What about bias? What about the word bias, which sometimes is defined differently maybe than people might have different definitions of bias. We all bring bias. Do you believe that? Do you think that journalists have bias?
Yes. Do they bring it out in their storytelling to an egregious level?
What do they do with it? Yeah.
Right. I think my bias, as I said earlier, is my experience and, mm-hmm. and that which I can bring to a story. And as I get older, I'm glad that I bring on that bias, if you will. But the bias includes a lot of different things. It includes a lot of information.
It's a life experience, or what?
Yeah, I mean, we can go into that space. But once we cross the line, and I shouldn't say the line, once we cross the threshold from, I have all my thoughts and experiences and what I bring to it, when it comes to the story, I'm weeding all of that out. That is gone. But if it informs me to a story, so going back to trafficking, mm-hmm. I have a bias against trafficking. Right. So since I have a bias against trafficking, what does that mean? Well, what it brought to me is into a space of now I'm looking at why does it happen no matter what country I go to report on it. Yeah. Gender inequality. Why does that happen? That's a broader question, but it certainly helps me understand why we have trafficking. And the bias is so the bias has a lot of different potential outlets to this mm-hmm. conversation, mm-hmm. but to answer your question very straightforwardly, yep. Yes. Mm-hmm. And for me as a journalist, right. When it comes to telling a story, do I include that? No. I try my darndest, and my editors do a great job too, of taking out any sort of imbalance in the story.
I want to talk a little bit about MSNBC, and it's sort of the shorthand for many people is it's the opposite of Fox News.
I've never heard that. It's the first time.
Well, there's a first time for everything.
First time for everything. I've never heard that ever.
We were talking earlier, preparing for this evening, about some changes that MSNBC was making, mm-hmm. and I just was curious if you could talk some more about that. They were about refocusing it more on news, but continuing to have opinion, but where it played in the programming. And I wonder whether people recognize that, notice it, and right. Maybe just talk a little bit about what MSNBC is thinking about on that.
Yeah, I mean, I can't speak for the network, right. But what I can speak for is my observations as a consumer of news, and going into. So I was just if you've ever watched West Wing at all. But I went through the entire season in the last year, just because I loved the show.
So fun. Yeah.
I was living abroad at the time, so I wasn't able to watch the show, and I just, it's just fun.
Yeah.
But I was looking at how MSNBC was portrayed throughout that series over the course of the years.
Oh, interesting.
And it was a news source.
Yeah.
And you looked at the way they were expressing themselves. Then I think what you'll see, some of the observations of where we went in 2011 and 2012, is that MSNBC started to represent a point of view that was progressive and from the left. And it started with some hours and then became more hours and more hours. I think that's a common observation of what happened back in 2011, 2012. I think the observation that one might make today, looking at some of the critics out there, the TV critics who watch these sorts of things, is that within the last 2 or 3 years, you've seen those numbers of hours go down, and that you will see instead progressive point of views only in the evening. And going up to that point, you'll see that we have more hours that are news focused, where you have journalists that are anchoring, and you also see those who have the point of view from the right who are anchoring. We had Greta Van Susteren, for instance, at one point. We have Nicole Wallace, Hugh Hewitt, here from this campus, right from Hoover. And so our stable has grown to, I think, balance out what those observers may have said was before, and more focusing on, okay, what is the news? I think what you'll hear from the leadership is that we're just trying to be smart, and that's always our drive. We have to be thinking about whatever the content is. We can't just be we have to think about what's the context. Why is that important?
Right.
And I think when we have folks like Brian Williams, for instance, at 11 p.m. right now, just as one example, he will give context to stuff that only he can, because he's been everywhere. Lester Holt, the same. Nightly news, different product. He will give us context. He's a reporter's reporter, Lester Holt is.
Yep.
And a nice guy.
Yeah.
By the way, his nickname is Iron Pants.
Iron Pants. Why is that?
Because he used to anchor for hours during breaking news stories and never go to the bathroom. Hours and hours and hours and hours. He is the swellest guy.
Pants.
Yeah.
That's great.
Swellest guy.
That's great.
Sorry, Lester.
No, Lester's. Sorry, Lester. Thinking about the topic of tonight's discussion about how journalists cover bias, intolerance, and injustice, what are you most concerned about?
Yeah.
And what makes you feel most hopeful?
So when I was stood in the streets of Ferguson, there were two parts of me that were talking to each other. One was, wow, this is really bad and difficult. The other part was, wow, didn't I do this like 20 years ago? Wait, did? And then, so there's a third part too, which was, I'm glad I'm here. Because, and I can only imagine, because when I was there in the streets, those civil rights leaders that had worked through the 60s were still there in Ferguson and returning to Ferguson and trying to give counsel to those who were new to the space. I consider myself new to the space. But I had to report on the issue of Rodney King from California as a cub reporter.
Yeah.
So I felt more comfortable standing in Baltimore looking at the many sides that were fighting against each other and angry at each other. And you can see the tussle. Like, I was glad that I was there because I think I was able to bring a sense of an understanding of the story, but I was also super upset, as any American would be, that we are going through this again.
Yes.
And then you send me to Baltimore, and what am I doing? Again. So I was glad that I was sent there, Dawn, because, again, as we were saying, perspective, context. Now, I would not lead in my reports about here we are again, or I remember what it was like back during Rodney King. I wasn't there during the 60s, but I wouldn't lead with that. But I would suggest to my producer to suggest to 30 Rock, to the anchor, feel free to ask them about what this historically might mean in our recent history.
Yeah.
And I would reflect on the Rodney King time with our time 20 years, and it was weird to think 20 years later, because it didn't seem that long to me.
No. But having that historic perspective is really important and often missing, I think.
And that's why I was glad to be there, because it was a responsibility as a journalist to do the best we could to share the pain. Like, that was really what I wanted to share. Like, this is all bad, but my job was to share the emotion and the pain that we all might feel, given who we are, given that we fight for this country to be a great place, and I needed to try to do that. But I also had to tell you exactly what was happening that day. I mean, we were being shot at. We had security teams that we often
shot at.
Yeah, we have security teams that we often would send to conflict areas. For the war correspondents here, I mean, we had that same team with us in Ferguson. We also, when I had my gas mask issued to me, and I wasn't vlogging it, I didn't have my camera out, but I knew that was a moment when they were issuing my gas mask to me and giving me training on that as I arrived. I knew something was definitely different.
Yeah. We're going to go to questions now. Thank you. So the first question says, you mentioned telling stories from both sides / perspectives. How do you mitigate false equivalencies for the sake of telling both sides?
Right. And so I don't think I should be the arbiter of what is equivalent and what isn't. And if I were to do that, and it's way above my pay grade, what I do try to do is think of as argumentarian, putting on my rhetoric hat. And again, it doesn't mean, I know this is not the right or the best way, it's just the way I approach it, is that you, as the viewer, and our viewers are very, very smart. And so we never ever treat them as, okay, we need to go to the lowest common denominator. No. What we need to do is bring what I believe are the most relevant facts out, not sensationalized, most relevant, so that you digest it and you decide. The idea of false equivalency, sometimes, like, I brought up a couple examples where there is just no equivalency. When it comes to healthcare, for instance, that is way above my pay grade. But I do my darndest to be a great student and then provide what I believe are the 3 biggest points on both sides. And some people say, but Richard, that's, in some cases, false equivalency. How can you not, the argument obviously is, on one side, doesn't everybody have the human right to health care? The other side is, shouldn't it be an open market, free market sort of debate in terms of being able to access that, and that you work towards it. I can't arbitrate the equivalence of that, but I try my best to be an honest and inquisitive person. I try to be in your brain as being intellectually curious and trying to get the right answer out. That's what I try to do, and I don't get it right all the time.
Great, thank you.
Certainly.
This question is regarding people who are different from people in the Bay Area.
Wow, that's okay, all right, okay.
No, there's a continuing problem with, I say maybe majority, continuing problem with bias in reporters' coverage, often against religious people, ordinary people in the heartland. How do reporters maintain fairness? How do news organizations, what do news organizations do to promote it within their ranks? So coverage of people who are maybe not celebrities, maybe not, they're people who are religious, people who are in the heartland who may not get as much coverage as other people. Because the news organizations tend to be on the coasts.
I have never heard that before.
You never heard that?
Northeast-centric news, never heard about it. Have no idea what you're talking about. I think what we're going to need, so there was a phase where our bureaus, and all of our journalists in the room know this, there was a phase where we were seeing the number of bureaus across the country disappear from national organizations.
Yep. Yes.
And I mean, it's not a complex answer, and you know this so well, Dawn. We just have to be there. And so I feel great benefit that I was able to live in the South for 5 years, the Midwest for 2, and California and New York as well for many years, and abroad for other years. And I think that what we just need to go back to is go talk to them.
Go talk to people.
Right. So when I travel a lot, as you know, about 500,000 miles a year. I touch, I don't know, 50, 60 different spots in the United States and the world. And I'll tell you just 2 stories. Being in McMinnville, Tennessee, at Friday Night Lights at a high school game, and 2 candidates, left and right, going for state assembly. I stand right next to them. They're standing right next to each other. And I say hello. I said, let's take a picture together. Let's take a picture together. Now, that is what people don't necessarily know about politics in McMinnville, Tennessee. They get along. They're collaborative. They are gracious to each other. Mm-hmm. They do not fit the stereotypes that and neither do the voters in McMinnville, Tennessee, either. In Detroit, Michigan, when I go blue, when I go back to Michigan to either do something for the university or tell stories, I was just out there interviewing Emilio Gutierrez, who is a journalist, a Mexican journalist, who fled to the United States for safety. And as I was up there speaking with him, obviously there's an election going on, and the number of ads you saw from left and right just engulfed the airwaves. And when you spoke with folks, at least the ones I spoke to, they are those Midwestern voters that are the forever swing vote, if you will. They were passionate, and they were not of the space that I think that the stereotypes are often at. So the long answer to your short question is, how do we do that? We just go there and we talk to people and we spend time so that we can give context. Right. And so when I am doing stories, I brought up my visit to McMinnville many a time in the last month to offset what I think are easy lines that we get on Twitter, easy lines that we get from friends. Have you ever spent any time there? Have you ever lived there? Have you gone to any of their churches?
There we go. Going to get a couple more questions in. Anything to say about the current situation with Harvard admissions? Which I think this is the story.
What is that a university? we're at Stanford, aren't we?
Yeah, it's another place on the other coast.
Well, if you're talking about admissions and you're talking about, it's related, I think specifically, we were talking about the Asian American admissions. I believe
that's the story.
That's right, and affirmative action.
Affirmative action.
So it's certainly something that's been debated in this state and other great states. I think that, and I did a story on this very dynamic of, okay, so I think it starts with, if Asian Americans are testing so well, shouldn't they just be able to get in? Why would you cap the number let in, right? That's the basic question. Yeah. The debate here in California, when it hit the ballot, was, okay, does the public universities, do they eliminate that or not? All I can say is it needs to be worked out more. I know the debate when I was in the bus you're talking about, about these sorts of topics, was why is it more difficult for me to get into Berkeley? And now it's even more difficult if you look like me and you want to get into Berkeley. I know that, just the numbers. Yep. But you also have to think about what public education means. The reason why I got into Berkeley in the end is because I wrote, I think, a protest letter. They were not going to let me in. But I said to them, I was like, I worked for 5 years out of high school. I grew up with food stamps and poverty. We have an education system in this country, a public education system, which has one function. Every university has different functions, but public universities have one function, so they say. And it says in the master plan, and I'm paraphrasing obviously, the master plan for the state of California said, hey, this is meant for you, Louis. or Wong, this is meant for you. And so I wrote a protest letter when they didn't let me in, and I said, I'm that guy. I grew up with food stamps. I had to work at Mrs. Fields Cookies for 5 years, then go to City College of San Francisco, and now I'm applying to your 4-year institution, and the master plan says, hey, this is for you, guy.
This is for you.
This is for you.
Yeah.
But you didn't let me in. So I wrote a protest letter, and they let me in.
Wow.
So our systems it worked for me in the end.
Yep.
But they have a certain culture and I think purpose. The issue of what's happening at Harvard and the issue with our Asian American community is that it's an extremely diverse community with over 50 origin countries, with a very high performing upper 2% or something like that happens to apply to schools like Harvard and much better schools like Stanford and have high acceptance rates.
Yeah.
But you also have this other side of the ledger. I don't know if you know this, but over 50% of Asian Americans go to community college. Does that fit the stereotype?
No.
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 But that's the number.
Yeah.
That's the reality.
Yeah.
Did you know that the United Negro College Fund, that there's an equivalent for the Asian American community?
No.
There is. Did you know that in a lot of these in these grant spaces, it's written in that it's all groups can benefit based on their socioeconomic status, except if you're Asian American. Except if you're Asian American. That is why they started the equivalent to the United Negro College Fund for Asian Americans. It's just not the largest group in New York that lives in poverty. If you've been to New York lately and you've looked who's been going through the garbage cans over the last 20 years, they're Asian folks. 25% live in poverty in the Asian American community in New York City.
Wow.
They just don't necessarily like to talk about it as much.
Yeah. Right.
And so when you look at the dynamic of what's happening at Harvard, this is a super small group. I think those that would be critical of the argument to get rid of that would say, well, didn't your parents benefit from affirmative action? Isn't that why you now have the ability to be critical of affirmative action? Those would be critical of those saying that. That's the opposite argument.
Yeah.
Where I stand is not relevant, but I just know it's not going to be solved, right? Yeah. It's not going to be solved like right now. But sorry, I had to go long on that one because it's clearly a complex issue.
It is, and I'm going to do one quick last one,
Yeah.
and we're just about out of time. So the question is about the ranks of broadcast journalism and the diversity since you've become an anchor. How hopeful are you for the future of diversity in the media?
Ooh, in the media. So that's a big space. So I would say
you can do broadcast journalism if you want.
Yeah, well, how about I'll do broadcast first.
How hopeful are you for the future of diversity in broadcast journalism?
You know, I think that I've seen in the time I've been at 30 Rock, I've seen the first African American anchor take a seat that has never been held by a minority, Lester Holt. In the time I've been at 30 Rock, I've also seen the only Latino American male sit in an anchor seat in cable, Jose Diaz-Balart. I've also seen the first Latino American anchoring a national nightly news broadcast on the weekends, also Jose Diaz-Balart. So there's a lot of things that say we're living in some pretty cool times. But I've also seen the numbers of diverse faces overall go down in broadcast, in network broadcast and cable broadcast TV go down as well. Not holistic, in certain spaces, and other places go up.
Yeah.
I'm not seeing as many faces like mine. I'm seeing fewer now. Mm-hmm. But I'm also seeing in media overall in the sort of 16 zettabyte space and the 44 zettabytes of content we'll see come 2020. That's where we're seeing a lot of diversity, not only in color of face, but also of background, of state, of city, of particular background, whether it be a country you've come from, point of view. And therein lies, because all of us are not only watching nightly news or cable, we're getting stuff from all over the place. And therein lies the silver lining. That is actually getting really, really fat and chubby, that silver lining, because of the sheer amount of content we now have that is not regulated by technology, what we call OTT now, right, over the top. It's going straight to all of us.
Right.
And that's the amazing thing. We can opt into all of this space. I'm super positive about what that means at the end of the day, because there's only so long that, as we know, especially being in a very creative space like Stanford and the Valley and California, that new models will often affect old models. Old models don't go away, they change, or they do go away is what happens. The new models also evolve and survive somehow. So I'm very, very positive.
Great. Well, thank you, Richard. It's been a great conversation. I appreciate your time.
Thank you. Thanks.
So good evening and welcome back from your break. I'm Michael Bolden, your other co-host for this series and Managing Director Communications for the John S. Knight Fellowships here at Stanford. Just a reminder, please submit your questions via index card. Our Administrative Director, Erica Bartholomew, over here, will be patrolling the aisles, both handing out blank cards and collecting your questions. So if you have a question or you want a card, just raise your hand and Erica will come to you. Now for part two of our evening. Tonight I've turned my moderating duties over to one of our talented JSK Fellows, Geraldine Mariba. Geraldine is a journalist, filmmaker, and the founder of Mariba Media, her own media firm. She is the executive producer of two major PBS initiatives, Chasing the Dream and Peril and Promise. She is also the director and writer of Until 20, an independent documentary about James Reagan, a young athlete diagnosed with a rare cancer. She has received New York Film Festival Awards, Emmy Awards, and Peabody Awards. And prior to launching her media business, she held a blended role as an executive producer and vice president of inclusion at CNN. The rest of our panel is just as accomplished. Here are some short biographies. Please check Canvas, our online class platform, for more details. To your left, we have Hannah Allam. She's a national reporter for BuzzFeed News, covering U.S. Muslim life. She previously spent a decade as a foreign correspondent with the McClatchy newspaper chain, serving as Baghdad bureau chief during the Iraq War and Cairo bureau chief during the Arab Spring. She has also covered foreign policy and race and demographics. She was part of McClatchy teams that won a Polk Award for Syria reporting and an Overseas Press Club Award for exposing death squads in Iraq. Seated next to Hannah is Ugo Balta. He's a management trainer, talent coach, and president of the National Association of Hispanic Journalists. Previously, Hugo was senior director of multicultural initiatives at the Disney ABC television group, where he led a unit focused on raising the quality, profile, and delivery of diverse news gathering and storytelling. One of his responsibilities was the creation of video and multimedia content targeting the U.S. Hispanic audience across all platforms. Seated to the left of Geraldine, Janae Desmond Harris. Janae is a staff editor for the opinion pages of the New York Times and a graduate of Harvard Law School. She is a 2016 alumna of the JSK Fellowships. Before becoming a fellow, Janae worked as a staff writer for Vox.com, covering race, law, and politics. Previously, she was an editor at The Root, an African-American news site, where she served as White House correspondent, authored an advice column answering race and culture-related ethics and etiquette questions, and hosted a politics and pop culture podcast. And seated on the end is Brian Pollard. Brian is a member of the Cherokee Nation. He served 2 terms as president of the Native American Journalists Association before joining the staff of the organization this summer as director of programs and strategic partnerships. Previously, he served as communications director and AmeriCorps Vista coordinator at the Indigenous Food and Agricultural Initiative at the University of Arkansas. Prior to that, he was executive editor of the Cherokee Phoenix, the tribal news media for the Cherokee Nation, which was first published in 1828. That's your second panel. Geraldine, take it away.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you all for coming tonight. This is going to be fun. I have the challenge of topping the first hour, and you guys had the luxury of an entire hour with 2 people. We have 5 of us and 1 hour. So we're going to go rapidly. It'll be rapid fire, and let's begin. Hannah, I'm going to start with you.
Okay.
It's said that journalism happens where fear and courage meet. Let's talk about those 2 words, fear and courage. Is Islamophobia racism?
Rapid fire, right?
Rapid
There's
fire.
no nuance. So is Islamophobia racism? It is such a complex question. It gets right to the heart of language, which is something that I deal with. It's one of the trickiest parts of my beat. Because before we even get to is it racism, what is Islamophobia? And that is something that, that's a debate actually going on among US Muslim communities right now. One camp sort of says, why do we need to call it Islamophobia? We have perfectly good words like bigotry and racism and xenophobia. We already have those names. And also this attachment of phobia, doesn't that sort of underscore that there's something to fear about Islam? And then the other camp says, no, this is a specific systematic discrimination against a group. We name it so we can study it and you can quantify it. And so before we even get to whether it's racism or not, we don't even know, we don't even have a set definition of what Islamophobia is. And so it's certainly, it's a form of hatred, but it also exists sort of parallel to a lot of other forms of hatred. And we know that it's, Muslims in general, it's been said, there's a lot of academic papers you could read about it, about sort of the racialization of Muslims. And that's something that you can see when you have hate crime attacks that target Sikhs or South Asians or Christian Arabs who are not Muslim. So obviously there's a racialized factor, and then of course there's a quarter of all U.S. Muslims, at least I think, is African American. Most of them are homegrown Muslims, not foreign. And so there, I think of the case of Nabra Hassanan, just briefly. A 17-year-old girl killed on her way home from the mosque about 2 Ramadans ago, I think. And that was a case where the community, the greater Muslim sort of community and the activists, that she was targeted because she was Muslim. And her family, who was of Nubian origin, Sudan and Egypt area, said she was targeted because she was black. And so these are really contentious debates, but obviously a form of hatred and exists parallel and is sometimes in tandem with lots of other forms.
Thank you. Hugo, for members of the audience, the Pew Research Institute is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research institution that studies media largely. And according to the Pew Research Institute, the top issues for Latinos is not immigration. There's a surprise. It's actually the economy and education. If you watch our news coverage, you would think that that's all Latinos care about. Why do we get it so wrong when we tell stories about Latinos?
Well, I think that that is because newsrooms across the country, and I'm generalizing a bit, but there's stats that support it, are lacking diverse voices. Overwhelmingly, regardless of the platform, the decision makers, both in front of the figurative and literal camera, regardless of platform, are not people of color, are normally the establishment. Usually that is a white, middle-aged male. And so the coverage of the midterm elections is being produced from a point of view that is not of the community. It is the point of view of covering the election of the other. And so whether it's Latino, African Americans, women, etc., it's always very one-dimensional. It is the lowest hanging fruit. Every issue is around immigration or immigration reform because that is the perception of the news gatherers. It's when the news gatherers are members of the community and can produce stories from a perspective of authenticity and authority that you start to peel the onion and have a better understanding of what it is that concerns this community. And then the last thing on that is this notion of the other. When we start to think about who has the right to vote in our country, they're citizens of the United States. And when you start to look at the U.S. Hispanic population, of the nearly 60 million, the largest majority are U.S. born, are citizens of the United States. So while immigration might be relevant because as a second generation Latino, a son of immigrants, I certainly I was witness to that experience, it is certainly not my immediate issue. And so my issues are the same as all citizens of the United States. It is about the economy. It is about healthcare. It is about crime. And so that is what's at the core for this midterm elections. But again, it's the sophistication of the newsrooms in telling stories from a point of view that is different from their own.
And representation.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I also think that is an interesting follow-up to the last question that Richard Louis that you answered, which was the future of our newsrooms. Because while on-air representation tells one story, behind the scenes it's actually another story. And over the past couple of decades, we've seen the numbers of diverse people in our newsrooms decrease. Mm-hmm. So on that note, Janae, you're a former JSK fellow. Shout out to the fellows. Your research focused, when you were a JSK fellow, on developing a curriculum to teach journalists about unconscious implicit bias. And if anybody in the audience ever wants to test, if you want to test your own bias, there is an online test called the Implicit Bias Association test. It takes a few minutes. It's fascinating and revealing. I won't tell you what it said about me, but it's worth doing. And what you'll find is no matter how many times you take the test, if you're truthful in your responses and you fire rapidly, your answer is always the same. So that's my question. If unconscious bias is that, it's unconscious. We're not consciously doing things. These are unconscious behaviors. How can we change it? And the second part of it is, how does it surface in our reporting?
So when we think of the word bias, especially in a class session that's about bias along with hate and intolerance, we probably think of a really negative word that means maybe we're racist, maybe we're sexist, maybe we don't like people from other parts of the country. My colleague Tanya Mosley and I, as we were researching this, actually found that that kind of bias is not really what's most at play when it comes to the things that get in the way of journalists covering different groups of people appropriately. What actually is going on is something called cognitive bias. And a cognitive bias is an error in thinking that occurs when people are processing information. So every single person who has a brain has cognitive biases. It just means that you're thinking and that you're human, and lo and behold, journalists have brains and are human as well. So it's no surprise that whether or not we harbor animosity toward other groups, or whether we think we're prejudiced against other groups, we still have cognitive biases that affect our reporting. Spoiler alert, we can't get rid of them altogether. And we would have loved to create a workshop where at the end we gave a certificate and said, you no longer have cognitive biases. Instead, we were just able to give people some tools to be more aware of them. I'll just give you a couple of examples of how cognitive biases work. And excuse me if I read from my paper, because some of this is from social science and I'm just a journalist. So one main type of cognitive bias is called a confirmation bias. And that's the tendency to search for or believe information that confirms your pre-existing belief or hypothesis. So has anyone here seen the movie Spotlight?
Yes.
Spotlight's a wonderful example of this because some of the Boston Globe journalists, by their own admission, really believed in the Catholic Church and had a hard time imagining that the priest there could be doing anything so terrible to children. They missed that story for a really long time. And that was an example of confirmation bias getting in the way of their work. Another one is called the availability heuristic. And that's just a mental shortcut that tells you if you're thinking about something, it must be important. A great example of how this affected journalism was, you may remember the Ebola virus panic of 2014. We were all really worried about Ebola, journalists included. Despite the fact that there were only 4 cases in the United States, you saw wall-to-wall coverage of that bias because we all thought, if we're thinking about it, it must be important. Another one is called the halo effect. That's a cognitive bias that refers to an observer's overall impression of a person and how that influences the way you think about that person. So an example that we used to illustrate this was the fact that when white women are kidnapped or murdered, studies show they receive much more coverage than when black women or children are kidnapped and murdered. And this is believed to reflect the idea on behalf of many Americans, including those who become journalists, that there is a halo around white women, that they are more innocent and more pure, and that therefore their disappearance or murder is bigger news. So that can creep into our coverage. The bad news, like I said, is that we all have cognitive biases. The good news is that there are some ways not to get rid of them, but to kind of put a check on how they affect our work. Just some quick tools that we came up with for journalists to think about on every story. 1, assume that you're not very smart. Question everything you know about what's important, what's urgent, what people care about. Take 1 second to really just question every assumption that you have. Another one is to lean heavily on data and expert opinions instead of these sort of boilerplate languages that we use and just very familiar ideas about different groups that we tend to throw out there again and again. Another one is to have colleagues from different backgrounds check your work. Read over it before it's published and just say, are there any red flags that popped up that might reflect something I'm missing here or a blind spot that could be caused by one of my biases? And the last one was simply to slow down. We read a book about fast thinking and slow thinking. And when you're thinking fast, you're using stereotypes, you're making automatic assumptions, and you're missing a lot. If you can simply slow down, a lot of times you can get in the way of these own biases before they affect your work.
One thing about, and I agree with everything that you said, but I think there's also willful ignorance. I think despite the fact that real educated persons have all of that information and understand how biases work, because 98% of the decision making that we do is unconsciously. This is years and years of evolution. Really, we only use 2% in making decisions where we're thought out. But there is willful ignorance. And even though it's laid out the way you've described it, I'm still going to make a decision based on my gut reaction, or better yet, to control a situation. So I think sometimes I feel that when we talk about unconscious bias, we talk about biases in general, it's a handicap for something that's larger, which is willful ignorance, which is prejudice, which is racism.
Right, and I think that's what Hannah was talking about in your first response. It's about wanting to stay with what's familiar and not becoming exposed to something.
That's purposeful.
Yeah,
that's purposeful.
Right, yeah.
That's there is of course a conscious bias where we're all human beings. We want to feel comfortable, and so we gravitate to what's familiar. That is unconscious bias. But there's also the control aspect of maintaining power and maintaining, in most cases, marginalized groups down.
Yeah, there is something called pattern matching in the lexicon of biases as well. And pattern matching is what happens when you hire people you're comfortable with, people who look like you, they go to the same bar, they live in the neighborhood, you maybe share a babysitter, or you worked in the same place before, but you're hiring people you're comfortable with. And what happens when you do that is this, across the newsroom, everybody looks alike, and everybody lives in New York City, everybody lives on the Upper West Side, really. It's just the fact.
And it's not just the optics of it, it's about socioeconomic backgrounds, education. So it's not that it's all about race and gender and age, because there's homogeneous leadership could be about where you grew up in which part of the country, where you went to school, and again, your personal wealth. So even they might look different, right? Diversity, they might look different, but then when you start to peel the onion, they're very much alike.
I think it's a good point about willful ignorance, and an interesting thing about this workshop is that when Tanya and I asked to present it to different newsrooms, we always tell the newsroom leaders or the conference leaders that we want this to be a voluntary session, because if you don't want to address your biases, you don't even have hope of having this be effective for you. So the first step is actually, it's one of those things where your intention to fix it is really like 99% of the battle.
And people showed up?
Yeah.
Good.
I can just jump in and talk about the mascot issue. That's one of the things that, an issue that Naja has championed is the eradication of native imagery in sports mascots and other industries. But we see that at play, where people hang on to those images and they fight changing it, despite the fact that there is mounting evidence at how harmful they are to native children and just children in general when they see that type of imagery.
So I don't want to leave you out of the conversation, Brian, because you're on the end. Everybody, just so you know, you have these, what I'm going to show you and explain in an email already. There is, these are all tools to help when you're reporting stories related to indigenous people. This one is a chart that says, so you need an indigenous expert, and it's like a flow chart explaining how to find one. There is a style guide with definitions of words, indigenous, tribe, tribal, mascots, treaties, trust, responsibility. And then there's a bingo game. And on the bingo, who likes bingo? On the bingo game, there are words like drugs, casino, something sacred, unemployment, addiction, reservation, singing, poor education, suicide, and it goes on. Let me ask you, Brian, why is it necessary to provide these tools still?
Yes, that's the question I ask myself all the time. Every time we develop one of these guides, I ask that question. So we developed, the Native American Journalists Association has seen patterns in what we consider to be poor coverage of Native communities. And whenever we pick up on a pattern, several years ago we decided, let's just develop a guide that we can deploy out into newsrooms that just give people kind of a helpful reminder of some of the things they need to keep in mind when they're covering Native communities. The first one that we did was actually for the Indian Child Welfare Act, which was recently struck down by a district court. But we developed them because I think we see in newsrooms a real blind spot when it comes to Native communities. And so we've developed these, anyone who's familiar with our guides will see that they're kind of a mix. The guide is part nuance that helps people understand Native communities and Native people better, so that they know how to approach those communities and how they might be able to get better information from those communities. But another big part of our guides really is just basic journalistic ethics. And I think one of the things that disappoints us many times is that oftentimes the ethical code of conduct that all journalists should be abiding by seems to just be suspended or sometimes abandoned when they're covering Native communities. And so we always include that in our guides, that this is still, even though Native Americans represent a very small portion of the American population, they still are deserving of all of the same journalistic ethics that you would apply covering any other community.
Hannah, the annual FBI hate crimes report showed that the next one's actually coming up in
Very
November,
soon, yeah.
very soon. The last one was 2017, and in 2017 it showed an uptick in incidents motivated by bias against Jews, Muslims, and the LGBTQ community, which was higher than the year before, 13% higher than the election year the year before. What are you predicting we're going to find in the next report? And what do we need to do to start, as journalists, helping to reverse this pattern and these numbers?
Yeah, this next report is due in mid-November, and that one will be really interesting because they're a year behind because of how the data is collected. So this one will be essentially Trump's first year in office. And so there's a lot of interest in what that looks like, and was there a spike. But, I mean, I always have to remind people, these are far from perfect numbers. A lot of places don't have hate crime laws, they don't report them, there's wide variations in how they're reported and how officers are trained to report these. So the experts that I talk to in an interview whenever the hate crime report comes out caution that it is not a good tool for counting the number of hate crimes. It is a good tool for observing trends and identifying trends and following those, and of course the sort of attacks on Muslims, as well as other religious minorities, but Muslims had the highest leap from year to year. That's something that, yes, we expect to go up. And even knowing that that's a conservative estimate, as far as predictions, I mean, that's not my business. I have to report on sort of the phenomena. I can't make sort of prescriptions on how we can change it. But I do note that one of the most interesting things to come out is it Brian Levin or Bruce Levin here in California? He runs the Center for Extremism and Studies, and he said that after then President Bush came out and defended Islam, separated Islam, the religion, from the 9/11 attackers, that there was an immediate drop in retaliatory hate crimes against Muslims. So contrast that with the day that then candidate Trump first floated this idea of a Muslim ban, a travel ban. The words he used, I will never forget it, is precipitous increase. And so, if we are going to start somewhere, I mean, I think we'd be foolish not to look at that rhetoric and see some kind of, I think it's too complex to say cause and effect, because there are many other factors. An election year in general, there's always an uptick. So I think now that we've moved on to that, now we can see what the trends sort of look like under the first year of Trump, with the big caveat that it's an undercount. I hear stories almost weekly on my beat about someone's hijab being yanked off in the grocery line, being told to go home when you're at Burger King ordering, food for your kids. Those don't make it into the hate crime report. So, yeah, I think that we're probably, sadly, set to see more of the same.
Okay. Brian, I'm going to jump to you. Let's talk about the invisibility of Native communities in our national coverage. In 2016 and 2017, Standing Rock forced the national media to finally pay attention to Indian country. It was a top story both years. 2 years later now, most recently, the Standing Rock Sioux Council voted unanimously to support efforts to stop pipelines in Minnesota, Montana, South Dakota, and Louisiana. How many people in the room know that happened? Okay, a handful of people. It didn't make big headlines, and it's actually a big deal. Is there a way to change the invisibility of Native communities in our national coverage?
I think that typically when we're talking to leaders in newsrooms, mainstream newsrooms specifically, we always encourage folks to try to hire Native journalists. But you really just run into a math problem. There's not that many of us. And so that's not really a prescription that is practical in many ways. And so really the main thing that we try to encourage newsrooms to do is to diversify their coverage. We know that when newsrooms dedicate themselves to improving their coverage in Native communities, when they apply resources to it, that they can do better. And we've seen examples of this. High Country News actually is a really good example. They're an environmental news magazine based in Colorado. And they came to me a couple of years ago and they said, you know what, we want to do this really well. We want to cover Native communities. We want three-dimensional contextual storytelling in Native communities. Help us do this. And so we worked with them, Naja worked with them. They set up a desk, an Indian country desk. And they today are, they did what they said they were going to do. They applied resources to it. They were very serious in their commitment to it. And now they are doing some of the best coverage in all of Indian country. It can be done. I think there just has to be a commitment in the leadership of newsrooms that this is a community that they want to cover. They want to cover it contextually and fairly and accurately. And they just need to commit the resources to do it. And hopefully consult with, folks like us at NAJA, other Native journalists who are familiar with those communities to set those beats up so that they can do the coverage right. But I think diversifying coverage is possible. There just needs to be a commitment to do it.
Janae, during the Kavanaugh hearings, Bette Midler tweeted that women are the N-word of the world and that they are the most disrespected creatures on earth. Why did that comparison of the struggle between women and race cause so much controversy? Because I don't think people totally understand, and why does the distinction matter?
Right, so I think that obviously Bette Midler was really frustrated with the way women were being treated and tried to make the most, dramatic comparison that she could think of. That's probably the most generous way of looking at it, right? I think the reason it hit a nerve was that it is almost impossible to make that statement if you remember that some women are also Black. So she was sort of revealing that she saw women and Black people as two totally separate groups with no overlap. And also possibly the struggles of Black people as being like in the past or not of this moment. So I think it hit a nerve on that level. And also because it represented some patterns that people would argue that we see coming from the media. Think about a lot of the stories you see, whether it's about fashion or hairstyles or trends or polling on support for a certain candidate. A lot of times if you look at headlines that say women, and then you go beneath that and look at the statistics, it turns out the story is actually about white women. So the frustration with what she said represented a larger frustration about the fact that sometimes people, even journalists, tend to forget that not all women are white.
Hugo, hello.
Hello.
I'm going to read just a few names.
Sure.
Chicano, Chicana, Chicanx, is that correct?
Yes, yeah.
Okay, Latino, Latina, Latinx, Hispanic, Boricua, Garifuna, I can keep going.
Yeah.
These are just a few of the long list of ways that people of who are Latino or Hispanic or Latinx,
Right. Even those two.
define themselves, whether they're from the Americas, the Caribbean, Central America, Mexico. The idea is that each term has a slightly different meaning. Language is powerful and identity is constantly evolving. What does it mean to be Latino, Latina, Latinx today, and how do we know what language to use?
Well, one of the things that you said was interesting. It's how they self-identify. It's not they self-identifying. Hispanic is a government-invented word. Latino as well, and sometimes they're used interchangeably. Hispanic is about language. Latino is about geography. So anybody who speaks, anybody from a Spanish-speaking country is Hispanic. So that includes Spaniards. Everybody who's Latino, the geography, is from Latin America, basically Mexico down. So Brazilians are Latino, but they're not Hispanic. Spaniards are Hispanic, but they're not Latino. Hispanic is the way our government loves to put things into nice, neat boxes. We're on the eve of the U.S. Census, and it's all about self-identification. It's about every 10 years, our country counts us. But Hispanic, if you meet someone who's Hispanic or Latino, like myself, I don't say, hi, my name is Hugo Balta, I'm a Latino, I'm a Hispanic. First thing I'm going to tell you is I'm from Jersey. That's and usually, it gets this reaction. But people say, I'm Peruvian, I'm Cuban, I'm Mexican, Mexican American. They self-describe from either their country of origin or where they can trace their family's roots. And all of them are correct. It's simply put, this is a very diverse group. Yes, some of them have a common language, but even within the language, there are different dialects, different vocabulary. It's like trying to say that even though someone from New York and someone from Missoula, Montana, they're not Americans, or there's a different culture between someone who lives on the West Coast and in the East Coast, but they're all considered Americans. So I think in this group, it's celebrating a common history, and a lot of that has to do with colonialism, of course. Yes, language is how they self-identify, but not only. Language, especially with technology and us continuing to be a global society, language is no longer a barrier. Actually, really, outside of the United States, pretty much every country is multilingual. It is not a luxury, but a necessity in order to communicate, in order to grow your businesses. So in regards to what is right and what is wrong, there is no wrong, there is no right. It's an understanding that even though I am Peruvian American, because of where I trace my roots and my parents being from that country, I am 100% American and 100% Peruvian as far as culture. Language proficiency is important, but not as important as cultural proficiency. And I think once we become more culturally proficient, then we can have true conversations, true communication.
Brian, what if I threw the same answer to you and asked about how to identify people from various indigenous communities in America?
I think that one of the things that we are constantly cautioning our colleagues in media against is just using the term Native American. It's used ad nauseum. When you're describing, all of the, pan-Indian peoples of North America, you can use that term. But really, you need to keep in mind that there are almost 600 distinct cultural peoples that inhabited this continent prior to its colonization. And so we encourage media to identify people by those cultures. And so they would identify me as a Cherokee rather than identifying me as a Native American.
So be more specific.
Yes, identify them specifically to the culture that they belong to. Yeah.
So I'm going to ask a couple of questions that are general, and any of you can jump in. Because I think there are so many issues that apply to all of us. With the increasing way we consume news, it's very personalized, whether we get it through social media or we go to our favorite websites or favorite cable station. If we are now consuming increasingly in silos, information silos, how do we build bridges in our increasingly divided world? And how do we share stories that touch more people if people are sort of turning inwards?
Can I, this is, and I know this, I feel like embarrassed to say because it's almost like a luxury now to get to go to travel to so many places have been cut. I worked at McClatchy for many, many years, and I saw, the chipping away of resources at a newspaper chain that serves so many communities around the country. So I know that what I'm about to say is a luxury, but I did this past summer, I'm from Oklahoma, and I decided I wanted to get out of the DC echo chamber, and I really wanted to go back home. So I took my son, we moved home to my mom's, and I reported throughout the South, Texas, Georgia, Oklahoma, and other places. And I mean, it was just refreshing I mean, as painful as some of the moments were to witness and some of the things to hear, I mean, walking into an Oklahoma cafe where I was gonna, write for the day, and I asked for the Wi-Fi code, and she said, yes, it's media plague, no space. Okay, nice to feel welcome. But it's, to see those things, I mean, up close, to see how Russia was not registering, how that's not what everybody was talking about down there, how they were trying to get rent together for the month, how they were, turning the urgent care into their primary care. I mean, those were the things that I took away from that whole experience. And yes, I did hear horrendous views about Muslims. And to know, I guess it's just to really know what's out there. So you can, and it's part of the exercise, though, that makes a beat like mine and all of ours really difficult, because when you have to spend so much time myth busting before you can even get to the news, there's an opportunity cost to that. There's stories that you don't get to because first I have to say, I have to poke at the fact, no, Muslim teens are not disappearing in the night from their bedrooms and going en masse to ISIS. Around 250 total, the FBI said, tried to go or made it. And so that gets to the willful blindness thing you brought up. That's 0.0075% of the US Muslim population, but this was portrayed and hyped as this really, really big threat. And so I think what Brian was saying earlier about the suspension of ethics, I don't think we need to write new rules necessarily, but to apply them equally. And so I don't know, getting out of those activist circles, I think really, really did help me and make me think about who is the audience, what stories am I telling, what are themes that are universal that could even maybe penetrate that willful blindness and make people see the people that I write about as human.
And I think that's key, universal. I think we need to be better storytellers. I thought the part of the conversation about objectivity and fairness and accuracy was really interesting. We're human beings. We're not objective. And journalists are trained to stay on the sidelines as if we are in a pedestal or we're above what happens. But many journalists are members of the community, and they're telling stories that also affect them. Universal is very important. One of the most popular stories this year around immigration reform was the separation of families at the border. That was the first time in the 2 years since Donald Trump won the election that it actually brought people together. People can disagree about immigration reform, but people can agree you don't separate a toddler from their mother. You don't separate children from their parents. And then, if you're going to separate them, you don't separate them without a way to bring them back together. I went on a cruise with my family, and as soon as we were separated, we had bracelets. I knew how to get back to my son and my daughter. How could it be something as simplistic that is given when you go on a cruise could not be applied by the government? So it's about telling stories that, yes, have a very specific nucleus about undocumented immigrants crossing the border. But when you start to make it universal, when you start talking about who we are as human beings, parents and children, that's when we're making connections. That's when we're actually having conversations that in a span of less than a week, a strong rhetoric of zero tolerance went from, no, we got to bring them back together. And that we don't do enough of that. As journalists, we don't do enough of that.
I know we talk a lot about getting people out of their silos and how we tend to get more and more news that we agree with because of algorithms and the way our news feeds and our networks are set up. If I could change one thing about the way people consume media, it actually would not be to get people out of their silos, it would just be to teach media literacy. I've learned that a lot of people don't know the difference between news and opinion, or don't recognize legitimate reporting versus blogging. I think it would be so valuable if we taught people tools to understand what they're reading and how serious it is and how real it is. If someone reads one of Hannah's pieces at BuzzFeed about hate crimes against Muslims, I don't think I don't think anyone's helped by them then going to Fox News and reading the Muslims are terrible. That's out of their silo, that's balance, but I don't think that creates a smarter person or a better world. I would rather have them look at everything they read and weigh it according to who wrote it, what it's based on, what the publication is, and whether it's based in fact or opinion.
I think what we try to encourage when reporting on Native communities is reporting on the humanity of Native people. Because the stereotypes are so persistent in society, the feathers and teepees and powwows and all that stuff. These are the images that come to mind when you think about Native people and Native communities. But those of us who work and live within Indian country understand that we are people trying, who are members of this greater American experiment. And we're trying to feed our kids and care for our elders and make our neighborhoods and our communities a better place. And we don't see enough of that kind of reporting in Native communities. In fact, we see very little of it. And so I think that whether you're talking about Native communities or really any community of color or any community, we need more stories just about, to Hugo's point, about, the humanity that we all share. And I think that would go a long way.
So okay, I got my signal. I'll save, I have a question, but I'll save it.
That's quite a stack.
Yeah. Okay.
Next.
That sounds like it's for me.
Yes.
That sounds like it's for me.
But this one is for you. So this is, don't op-ed pages, opinion pages simply exacerbate cognitive biases. Couldn't we more effectively burst our filter bubbles by curbing our consumption of op-eds?
I know there's a lot of criticism of op-ed pages, some of them fair. I don't think they exacerbate cognitive biases because those are just based on the way that our brains work, and reading something isn't really going to change that one way or another. Maybe what the person is saying, do they make our opinions more entrenched if we read something that we agree with? Mm-hmm. I think a solution is not to have people stop expressing their opinions and putting that in the newspaper. After all, we live in the age of social media, and if we don't provide an edited and fact-checked op-ed on the news of the day, someone's going to go to Twitter and just read someone's thoughts off the top of their head. I think a better solution is providing op-eds from a wider range of voices, including those that aren't heard as much. The two types of op-eds that I think are most effective and most important for, frankly, our democracy are not just someone's musings off the top of their head, but rather op-eds by people who have actual expertise and have dedicated all or part of their career to studying an issue and have data and facts and analysis to back up what they're saying, and two, pieces by people who are actually personally affected. Not just that they watch the news on it, but they're materially affected in their day-to-day lives by whatever the news of the day is. So, for example, I edited an op-ed by a woman who was in one of the family detention centers that's been set up with her young child. When we learned that they were going to be switching the children from the children's centers to the family centers, she wrote, "Guess what? I was in one of those actually several years ago. It was really terrible. Here's how we were treated. Here's everything that happened." That was based in fact. It was an opinion piece, but it was based in her personal experience. And no, I don't think that someone would be harmed by reading that.
But I also think this is a business, right? And that's part of the problem, because it's all about impressions. It's all about ratings. Why Native Americans are not getting the coverage that they deserve is because, unfortunately, around a decision-making table, people that are choosing which stories to cover, they're saying this is not selling. Why are we, I can turn on any cable news for any period of time and I'm just going to be bombarded with Donald Trump, Donald Trump, Donald Trump, Donald Trump. Why? Because people are consuming that content, because the ratings are up. Local news gets dinged for if it bleeds, it leads. There's so much crime. But you know what? We're turning on the local news for it. So until we start to manage ourselves better, that's still going to be a problem. I think some of the best journalism that I've seen is being done by not-for-profits and smaller community-oriented news, because they're covering stories that the larger media companies aren't, because they're very focused on the business part of media and not about the community themselves.
I always tell people I get to write a specialized beat and do things like go to Oklahoma for the summer because enough people click on cat quizzes. So I always tell people come to BuzzFeed for the cat gifts, stay for the investigative journalism.
That's a great
line.
That's great marketing.
Brian, there are 3 questions here for you, and they're all really similar. They're the same question.
Okay.
And everybody seems to want to know your opinion about Elizabeth Warren and her DNA.
Didn't see this coming. Yeah. So, full disclosure, I'm Cherokee. I had relatives that came across the trail during Indian removal, and so I do have some of my, let's just say, my own perspective on this. I guess what I'll say in general, and setting Senator Warren aside, because, for the most part I agree with her politics, but I think that she really did a disservice to Indian country with this particular political stunt. That type of quantifying of Native identity, whether it's through blood quantum, which is a measurement imposed by the federal government, or DNA testing, is a diminishing of Native people. It's a way of vanishing Native people. It's a way of picking apart their identity and dissecting it so that they can be deconstructed and destroyed. And I think if we're going to honor the indigenous people of this continent, we need to recognize their sovereign ability to determine who they are and who belongs in their community, and recognize that, and recognize the methods that they want to choose to do that. And I can tell you that it's not DNA testing. And so I think that she, I don't know what she was thinking, frankly, but because I think that she has really tried to cast herself, ever since this controversy kind of bubbled up, she's really tried to cast herself as an ally to Native people. But I think she really misstepped in this instance.
Here's a question. If, in fact, diversity is going down in newsrooms, in broadcast journalism, is it because there are less qualified people, or is it prejudice?
It's prejudice. Of course it's prejudice. To think that there aren't qualified people, whether they're women, or whether it's gender, race, ethnicity, or age, is preposterous. Not qualified people. As the president of one of many affinity journalism groups, one of the things that we struggle continuously is hearing from media managers that say, we just can't find
anybody qualified. We can't find them. They're not out there.
And then I'd say to them, well, we have 2,300 qualified candidates. It's just that you're not.
And that's just one group.
And that's just one group. That you're not being inclusive. It goes back to bias. It goes back to willful ignorance. It is prejudice. It is racism. It is a systematic way to control people. I mean, one of the you mentioned about how Native Americans are being portrayed. One of the things that I knew growing up, they were portrayed as the enemy. They were the bad guys. I remember playing with my set. The good guys were the cowboys, and the bad guys were the Indians. And if I apply it to my community, over the last 60 years, they're caricatures of who of what a Latino is. If you're, and it's microaggressions, right? And some microaggressions can be funny. It's the typical, if you're Latino, you're Mexican, you have a mustache, you're hot-tempered, you must love soccer. Those microaggressions are the things that chip away at our identities and make caricatures of our communities to people that are not members of the community, and so much so that the stereotypes then become their reality of who they are. That part of the problem is we're not telling our own stories. Others are telling our stories, and they're dictating the narrative of who our communities are.
Well, that coupled with the fact, am I allowed to give my opinion as the moderator? With the fact that the same systems of inequity that exist in every system in this country exist in our newsrooms. There are very systematic ways that people are squeezed out. And I'm sure we all have stories. But I'm going to use moderator privilege to ask the last question. And because we have just a few minutes and I know we're running out of time. There's a professor on campus, Fukuyama. I'm sure many of you have heard of him. He's pretty well known. He wrote a book recently. It's called The Demand for Dignity and the Politics of Resentment. And in his book, he really focuses on dignity as being a unifying factor for this country and for the future of the globe. And it's a good read. You should all read it. I recommend it. And he specifically talks about the last election and white voters and the fact that across all lines, whether it's gender or socioeconomics, contrary to the myth that it was just the flyover states, white people in the middle of the country that voted for Trump. There were a lot of white people out in New York, where I live, that voted for Trump across the country. Fukuyama's argument is that it was about dignity and a sense of a loss of dignity. So the question that I have for you guys is whether or not identity politics and the way that we may or may not be dividing ourselves, is identity politics undermining democracy? I know you guys didn't see that one coming.
Well, I mean, if it didn't work for that group in question to begin with, I mean, to them, where can they go but up? You know, if it wasn't working, if you can build houses of worship except mosques, if everyone can come to the country except Muslims, I mean, these tiny, I mean, they're not so tiny, there's tiny and there's not so tiny indignities that I will tell you, when I covered the Arab Spring rebellions, that started with a fruit vendor, you know, in Tunisia, a sidewalk vendor who was just tired of all those indignities. And, you know, when I would go to Tahrir Square, it wasn't the big, you know, equivalent of what would be, you know, the Russia investigation. It wasn't a massive corruption scandal that brought people there. It was the shakedowns from the beat cops every day. It was, you know, the demands for bribes at every level of government. It was, you know, being told, you can't stand here, you can't protest, you can't vote, you can't do this. It was all those indignities that boiled over. And sometimes I talk to my old, you know, colleagues who were more specialized in, you know, sort of conflict resolution studies and things like that, and they're alarmed at what they see here with some of that sort of tribalism and the factions, but also there are collective demands that these groups are making that I think a lot of people would say are long overdue.
So maybe the question's wrong. It's not, is identity politics undermining democracy? Maybe the question is, isn't democracy about identity politics? Any last thoughts that anybody wants to share before we say goodnight?
I think that last question sounds like an entire class session.
Yes.
I'll just leave it at what you said.
Okay. All right. Well, then, in that case, thank you all, and
Thank you.
Yeah, let's give one more round of applause to our panel here tonight. Just want to say a couple quick reminders. So we will be sharing the implicit bias test that was mentioned on stage in Canvas, along with all the resources, and I hope especially the bingo card. So thank you for joining us tonight. We will look forward to seeing you next week when it will be our 4th class. And we'll be talking about local news and how legacy media organizations are trying to adapt to a changing media environment while new business models are emerging, and we hope to fill some of the gaps. Thank you very much, and good night.